On Mother's Day, my daughter gave her mother-in-law a $20,000 diamond ring and a luxury cruise, and she gave me a $5 plastic bracelet. I said it out loud in my kitchen that night, just to hear how it sounded, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it, just to confirm that what happened that afternoon was real and not some strange misunderstanding my mind had twisted out of grief or loneliness. But the words didn't change no matter how many times I repeated them. They sat there in the air, cold and solid. Just like the way Emily's smile had looked when she handed me that tiny box, the kind you'd expect to hold a piece of costume. Jewelry from a clearance bin. Not a Mother's Day gift from the daughter you raised on your own after her father passed, the daughter you worked double shifts for, the daughter you once skipped meals for so she could have everything she needed without ever knowing what it cost you. And I remember standing there in Daniel and Emily's living room, sunlight pouring through those wide glass windows, the kind that make everything feel warm and perfect from the outside, and thinking how beautiful it all looked. The long dining table set with fresh flowers, the soft music playing in the background, the scent of roasted chicken and herbs filling the air. It was exactly the kind of day I used to create when Emily was little, back when Mother's Day meant hand-drawn cards and sticky hugs and whispered, "I love you, Mom," instead of polite smiles and carefully staged moments. And I had even brought a small gift for her. Nothing extravagant, just a delicate silver locket with her childhood photo tucked inside. Something meaningful, something that said I still remembered who we used to be, and I had arrived early, just like I always do, because I believe in showing up, in being present, in making an effort even when no one else seems to notice. And when Linda arrived, everything shifted in a way I couldn't quite explain at first. Emily rushed to the door with a kind of excitement I hadn't seen directed at me in years, her voice lifting, her posture straightening, as if someone more important had just entered the room, and I watched as she hugged her mother-in-law with both arms, laughing softly, guiding her inside like she was the guest of honor, while I stood there holding my purse, suddenly unsure of where I fit in this carefully arranged picture. And then came the moment, the one I keep replaying in my mind. Emily clapped her hands lightly and said she had something special planned, her eyes sparkling in a way that made everyone turn toward her. And she presented Linda with a velvet box, deep navy blue, the kind you only see in high-end jewelry stores. And when Linda opened it, the room filled with gasps, a diamond ring, large enough to catch every beam of light, sitting perfectly on a bed of satin, followed by the announcement of a fully paid cruise, 2 weeks in the Mediterranean, first class everything, and everyone applauded. Daniel smiled proudly. Linda looked overwhelmed, and I smiled too, because that's what you do in moments like that. You smile, and you clap, and you pretend your chest doesn't feel like it's slowly caving in. And then Emily turned to me, her voice softer, almost as if this part didn't require the same energy, and she handed me a small white box, light as air, and I remember thinking maybe it was something sentimental, something personal, something just for me. But when I opened it, I found a thin plastic bracelet, pale pink, the kind you might find in a dollar store aisle. And for a second, I thought there had been a mistake, that perhaps she had mixed up the boxes, that somewhere, somehow, the real gift meant for me had been switched. But Emily just smiled, that same calm, practiced smile, and said, "I thought it was cute." And I nodded, because I didn't trust my voice in that moment, because I could feel something inside me shifting, something quiet and steady, something that wasn't anger exactly, but wasn't forgiveness either. And as I slipped that bracelet onto my wrist, feeling how light it was, how easily it could snap if I applied even the slightest pressure, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't even carelessness. It was deliberate, precise, and carefully measured. And the most unsettling part wasn't the bracelet itself. It was how easily everyone moved on afterward, how the conversation returned to travel plans and dinner plates and laughter, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, as if I hadn't just been quietly replaced in a role I once thought was permanent. And I stood there, smiling, nodding, playing my part. But inside, a single thought kept repeating itself, slow and clear, like a clock ticking in an empty room. This was not the beginning of something new. This was the confirmation of something that had been happening for a very long time. And for the first time, I decided I would stop explaining it away. I did not take the bracelet off when I got home. Not right away. Not even when I changed out of my dress and hung it carefully in the closet like I always do after family gatherings, as if treating the day with respect might somehow make it feel different in hindsight. Instead, I kept it on my wrist while I moved through the quiet of my house, turning on the kitchen light, setting my purse down in its usual place, rinsing a glass even though I was not thirsty, just to hear the sound of running water fill the silence, because silence has a way of making certain thoughts louder than they need to be. And tonight those thoughts were already sharp enough. I caught my reflection in the window above the sink, and for a moment I did not recognize the woman looking back at me, not because she looked older. I have made peace with aging a long time ago, but because there was something else there now, something more aware, more alert, as if a layer of softness had quietly peeled away, and I raised my hand slightly, letting the kitchen light catch on that thin strip of plastic. It did not shine the way the diamond had. It did not demand attention. It barely existed at all unless you were looking for it. And I wondered if that was the point, if it was meant to blend in, to be overlooked, to sit there without causing a scene, much like the role I had been playing for years without ever questioning it. And that was when the memories started coming back, not all at once, not in some dramatic rush, but slowly, carefully, like pieces of a puzzle being placed on a table one by one. Moments I had dismissed before, things I had explained away with kindness or patience or the simple belief that family meant well even when they fell short. I remembered the year Emily said they would celebrate Christmas early because Daniel had work commitments, only for me to later see photos of a full dinner at Linda's house on the actual day. I remembered the time she told me Emma's school recital had been rescheduled, and it would be too early in the morning for me to attend, only to hear from a neighbor that it happened at the usual time and the whole family had been there. I remembered birthdays that turned into quick phone calls instead of visits, invitations that arrived late or not at all, explanations that always sounded reasonable on the surface but left a small, quiet discomfort underneath. The kind you push aside because acknowledging it would mean admitting something you are not ready to face. And standing there in my kitchen, with that bracelet resting against my skin, I realized how many times I had chosen comfort over clarity, how many times I had accepted less because it was easier than asking why. And the truth settled in slowly, not as a sudden realization, but as a steady, undeniable presence. This was not new. It had not started today. Today was simply the first time it had been impossible to ignore, the first time the contrast had been so clear, so deliberate, that even I could not soften it with excuses. I dried my hands on a towel and walked over to the small desk by the window where I keep my bills and paperwork neatly stacked, habits from years of managing things on my own, and I sat down, not because I had something specific to do, but because sitting felt like the right thing in that moment, like grounding myself in something steady while everything else shifted. I placed my hand flat on the desk and looked at that bracelet one more time, noticing how easily it could be removed, how little effort it would take to slide it off and forget it ever existed. But I did not take it off, not yet, because for the first time, I did not want to forget. I wanted to remember exactly how it felt, not the sting, not the embarrassment, but the clarity, the kind that does not come often but changes everything when it does. And as I sat there, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing by outside, I made a decision that felt small on the surface but carried a weight I had not allowed myself to hold before. I would stop assuming. I would stop filling in the gaps with kindness that was not being returned. I would start paying attention, really paying attention, because whatever this was, whatever had been unfolding around me all this time, I had finally seen enough to know that it deserved to be understood, not ignored. The next morning arrived quietly, almost politely, as if the world itself had decided not to disturb whatever had shifted inside me the night before, and I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because sleep no longer held the same comfort it used to. There was a clarity now that made rest feel unnecessary, and I lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, feeling the weight of the bracelet still resting against my wrist. I had not taken it off, not even in my sleep. And when I finally sat up, I turned my hand slightly, watching how the pale pink plastic looked against my skin in the soft morning light. It was almost invisible unless you knew where to look, and I realized that was exactly how I had been treated for longer than I cared to admit, present, but not truly seen, included, but never centered, acknowledged. but never valued in the way that mattered. I made my way to the kitchen and started the coffee maker, the familiar routine grounding me in a way that felt different now, more intentional, less automatic. And as the machine hummed to life, I found myself replaying small details from the day before, not the obvious ones, not the ring or the cruise, but the quieter moments that had slipped by unnoticed at the time. The way Emily had positioned Linda at the head of the table without even thinking. The way Daniel had asked Linda what she preferred to drink before offering anything to me. The way conversation naturally flowed toward her, as if she were the center of gravity in that room, and I was simply orbiting somewhere on the edges. And I remembered how I had excused it in the moment, telling myself that it was her day too, that perhaps they were just trying to make her feel welcome, that maybe I was being overly sensitive. But standing there now, pouring coffee into my favorite mug, I could no longer ignore the pattern. It was not about one day or one gift. It was about a shift that had been happening gradually, quietly, consistently, and I had allowed it because it had been easier than questioning it, easier than risking conflict, easier than admitting that something fundamental had changed in my relationship with my own daughter. I carried my coffee to the small table by the window and sat down. The same place where I had helped Emily with her homework years ago, where I had listened to her talk about her dreams, her fears, her plans for the future, and I tried to reconcile that version of her with the woman I had seen yesterday, composed, calculated, careful in the way she distributed attention and affection, as if everything had a purpose beyond simple emotion. And that was when another thought surfaced, one I had not fully formed until that moment. What if this was not just about preference or closeness? What if there was something else guiding her choices, something more practical, more deliberate, something tied to decisions that extended beyond gifts and holidays? I set my mug down slowly, feeling a subtle tightening in my chest, not from hurt this time, but from awareness, and I began to think about the conversations we had not had, the topics she avoided, the way she deflected whenever I mentioned long-term plans or financial matters, the polite but distant responses whenever I brought up anything that required transparency. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that I had not been excluded by accident, but by design, that there was a reason I was being kept at a distance, a reason my role had been reduced to something symbolic rather than meaningful. And as that realization settled in, I did not feel anger the way I expected. Instead, I felt something steadier, something colder, a sense of focus that replaced the confusion I had carried for so long. I reached for my phone, not to call Emily, not to confront or accuse, but simply to look, to observe, to start paying attention in a way I never had before, because whatever this was, whatever had been unfolding behind polite smiles and carefully planned gatherings, I was no longer willing to remain on the outside of it. Not blindly, not quietly, not anymore. I did not call Emily that day, and I did not send a message either, which in itself was unusual, because I have always been the one to reach out first, the one who keeps conversations alive, the one who fills the silence before it has a chance to grow uncomfortable. But this time I let the silence stay exactly where it was, untouched, unsoftened, and instead I spent the day paying attention to things I had overlooked before, starting with something as simple as her social media, something I had always treated casually, liking photos, leaving short comments, never really studying what was there. But now I scrolled slowly, deliberately, as if each post might hold a piece of something I had missed, and it did not take long before patterns began to emerge in a way that felt almost unsettling in its clarity. There were photos of dinners at Linda's house, neatly arranged tables, coordinated decorations, captions filled with warmth and gratitude, words like family, home, and so blessed. And in those photos, Emily looked relaxed in a way I had not seen in years, her smile unguarded, her posture open, her hand often resting lightly on Linda's shoulder, as if that connection had become second nature. And then there were the gaps, the absence of moments I knew had happened with me, small visits, quiet lunches, things that had once felt meaningful but now seemed to leave no trace at all, as if they had never existed outside of my memory. And I realized then that it was not just about what was shown, it was about what was not, what had been carefully left out, what had been allowed to fade without acknowledgement. I set my phone down and leaned back in my chair, letting that realization settle without rushing to explain it away. Because for the first time, I did not want to protect the image of something that was no longer true. I wanted to see it exactly as it was, and later that afternoon, when the phone finally rang, I knew before I even looked at the screen that it would be Emily, and when I answered, her voice sounded light, almost cheerful, as if the day before had been perfectly ordinary, as if nothing had shifted at all. She asked if I had made it home safely, if I liked the gift, and there was a pause there, brief but noticeable, the kind that waits for reassurance, for confirmation that everything is still comfortable, still predictable, and I heard myself respond in the same calm tone I have used my entire life, telling her yes, I got home fine. Yes, the bracelet was thoughtful, and I could almost feel her relax on the other end of the line, as if that was all she needed, not truth, just compliance, and she moved on quickly, talking about the cruise plans, the itinerary, how excited Linda was, the places they would visit, the dinners they had already booked, and I listened, not interrupting, not questioning, just letting her speak. But this time I was not filling in the emotional spaces for her. I was not adding warmth where there was none. I was simply observing. And when she mentioned that they might be busy for the next few weeks because of preparation, that they might not have as much time to visit, I noted the phrasing carefully, the way it positioned distance as something temporary, something unavoidable, when in reality it had already become routine. And when the call ended, I did not feel the usual urge to call her back with something I had forgotten to say. Instead, I sat there for a moment, letting the quiet return, and I understood something with a level of certainty I had never allowed myself before. This was not a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up. It was a structure, a pattern that had been built slowly and maintained deliberately. And if I wanted to understand it, truly understand it, I would have to stop reacting to it emotionally and start looking at it for what it was, piece by piece, detail by detail, without flinching, without softening it. Because whatever role I had been given in this new arrangement, it was no longer one I intended to accept without question. The following day, I found myself opening drawers I had not touched in years, not because I was looking for anything specific, but because something in me needed to revisit the past with a different lens, one that was no longer softened by sentiment or filtered through the assumption that everything had been built on mutual care. I started with the old filing cabinet in the corner of my study, the one I had kept organized through decades of bills, receipts, school records, and documents that marked the quiet milestones of a life spent raising a child. And as I flipped through folders labeled in my own handwriting, I began to see a story that I had never fully acknowledged before. There were tuition payments from Emily's college years, lines of numbers that had once represented sacrifice, but that I had always framed as love. There were checks written during the early years of her marriage, small amounts at first, then larger ones, notes in the margins reminding myself that they were just temporary help, that they would get back on their feet, that family supports each other. And I remembered how I never kept track in a way that expected anything in return. I did it because I believed that what I was building was something lasting, something that would naturally hold me in its center as the years went on. But now, looking at those same records, I noticed something I had missed before, the gradual shift. The way the requests became less frequent, not because they needed less, but because they had found another source, another structure, another center that did not include me. And I sat there holding a faded receipt, feeling the weight of time in a way that was both heavy and clarifying. Because it was not about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about what that money represented, the belief that I was part of something reciprocal, something that would not quietly rearrange itself without me. And I closed the drawer slowly, taking a breath before standing up. The room felt different now, not unfamiliar, but redefined, as if the meaning of everything inside it had shifted just enough to reveal what had always been underneath. And later that afternoon, I made a decision that felt simple on the surface but carried a quiet finality. I drove to the bank, something I had not done in person for quite some time, preferring the ease of online transactions. But this required something more deliberate, more tangible. And as I sat across from the young woman at the desk, I found myself speaking with a clarity that surprised even me, asking for a full review of my accounts, my assets, the structures I had put in place over the years without ever questioning who they truly served. And she nodded politely, pulling up information, explaining details. But I was not there for explanations. I was there to see, to understand, to look at everything without assumption. And as numbers appeared on the screen, I realized how much of my life had been organized around the idea of eventually passing things on, of ensuring that Emily would be secure, that she would never struggle the way I had. And I wondered, not with bitterness but with a kind of quiet curiosity, whether she had ever thought about that at all, whether any of it had crossed her mind as she placed that bracelet in my hands. And when I left the bank, the air outside felt sharper, clearer, as if something inside me had aligned with the world in a new way, and for the first time, I understood that whatever I chose to do next, whatever decisions I made moving forward, they would not be guided by habit or expectation. They would be guided by what I now knew to be true, and that truth, once seen, could not be unseen. It was 3 days later when something small but undeniable confirmed what I had already begun to understand. And like everything else, it did not arrive in a dramatic way. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, just a moment that would have passed unnoticed if I had still been the person I was before that Sunday. Emily called in the early evening, her tone light, almost casual, asking if I could help her locate an old document, something about a copy of a financial statement from years ago. She said she thought I might still have it since I was always the one who kept records, and I listened carefully, not just to what she was asking, but to how she framed it, the way she presented it as a simple favor, something routine, something expected, and I asked her what exactly she needed it for, keeping my voice even, not suspicious, just curious, and there was a pause, longer than it should have been for such a simple question, followed by a vague answer about organizing paperwork and making sure everything was up to date. And in that moment, something settled into place with a clarity that did not require further explanation. It was not the request itself that mattered. It was the timing, the context, the pattern it fit into so precisely, and I told her I would look for it, which I did, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to see exactly what I had, what existed in my possession that might be of interest now. And as I went through the files again, more carefully this time, I began to notice details I had overlooked even just days before, documents related to property, old agreements, records of transfers and contributions that had been made quietly over the years, things I had never thought to question because they had been done in trust, in the assumption that intentions were shared and understood. And I realized that there were pieces here that connected more than I had allowed myself to see, threads that tied past decisions to present behavior in a way that felt deliberate rather than coincidental. And when I called her back later that night, I told her I had found the document, that I could send a copy if she needed it. And again there was that slight shift in her voice, that careful recalibration, as if she was measuring something, adjusting something, and she thanked me quickly, almost too quickly, before moving the conversation away from the topic entirely, asking instead about my day, about whether I had been keeping busy, and I answered simply, giving her nothing more than what was asked, nothing that could be interpreted or expanded upon. And when the call ended, I sat there with the document still in my hand, looking at the numbers, the signatures, the dates, and for the first time, I saw them not as isolated records, but as part of a larger structure, something that had been quietly built over time, something that I had contributed to without ever stepping back to see its full shape. And I understood then that whatever was happening now was not spontaneous. It was connected to choices made long ago, choices I had made with trust, without conditions, without the expectation that I would one day need to revisit them. And yet here I was, not with regret, but with awareness, holding evidence of a history that suddenly felt far more relevant than it ever had before. And as I placed the document back into its folder, I felt that same steady clarity return, stronger now, more defined, because each small moment, each quiet detail, was no longer standing alone. They were aligning, forming something that could not be dismissed or explained away, and I knew, without needing to say it out loud, that whatever came next would not be based on assumptions anymore. It would be based on what I had finally allowed myself to see. The following morning, I did something I had not done in years, not because I had been unable to, but because I had never felt the need to question what I had already set in motion long ago. I called my attorney, a man who had handled my late husband's affairs with a level of professionalism and quiet precision that I had always respected, and when his assistant answered, I scheduled an appointment for later that week. Keeping my voice steady, my explanation simple, I said I needed to review my estate planning, Nothing more, nothing less. And even as I hung up the phone, I felt a shift that was no longer subtle. This was no longer about observation. It was about action, not reactive, not emotional, but deliberate, measured, and entirely my own. And the days leading up to that appointment unfolded with a kind of clarity that made everything else seem almost secondary. I moved through my routines as usual. Grocery shopping, light cleaning, tending to small tasks around the house. But underneath it all, there was a quiet current of awareness that did not fade. Every interaction, every thought, every memory now passed through a different filter, one that did not allow me to soften reality into something more comfortable. And when Emily called again, which she did 2 days later, her tone was slightly different, not dramatically so, but enough that I noticed it immediately. There was a careful warmth in her voice, as if she were trying to reestablish something that had shifted without her fully understanding why. She asked if I had found the document, if I needed help with anything else, if I had plans for the weekend, and I answered as I had before, calmly, without offering more than what was necessary. And I could sense her adjusting again, trying to find the version of me she was used to, the one who filled in the spaces, who reassured, who made everything easy. But that version of me no longer existed in the same way. Not after what I had seen, not after what I had allowed myself to understand. And when the conversation ended, I did not feel the usual pull to maintain connection, to extend the moment. Instead, I set the phone down and returned to the documents spread across my table, reviewing them with a level of attention I had not applied before, looking not just at what they said, but at what they implied, what they enabled, what they assumed would happen in the future without ever being questioned. And by the time the day of my appointment arrived, I was prepared in a way that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with clarity. I walked into the office with a calmness that felt unfamiliar yet entirely natural. And when I sat across from my attorney, I did not hesitate. I explained that I wanted to review everything, not because something had gone wrong, but because I needed to ensure that what I had built over a lifetime truly reflected my intentions, not assumptions made years ago under circumstances that no longer applied. And he listened carefully, asking precise questions, pulling up documents, outlining options. And for the first time, I engaged in that conversation not as someone following a path already set, but as someone actively shaping it, making decisions based on what I now understood rather than what I had once believed. And as we discussed changes, adjustments, possibilities, I felt something settle into place with a quiet certainty that did not require validation. This was not about taking anything away from anyone. It was about reclaiming something I had unknowingly given up, the right to decide, to choose, to define what my life and my legacy would look like moving forward. And when I left that office, stepping out into the afternoon light, I did not feel heavier. I felt clearer, more grounded, as if the uncertainty that had once surrounded me had been replaced by something far more solid. And for the first time since that Sunday, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, not because anything had been resolved, but because I finally knew that whatever came next, it would unfold on terms that were no longer invisible to me. It was not until the following Sunday that everything came together in a way that no longer required interpretation. Emily had invited me over for dinner again, her voice carefully warm when she called, as if she were trying to recreate something familiar, something predictable, and I agreed without hesitation, not because I believed anything had changed, but because I needed to see it clearly, not through memory or reflection, but in real time. And when I arrived, the house looked just as it had before, perfectly arranged, softly lit, everything in its place. And for a moment, it would have been easy to fall back into old habits, to step into the role I had always played, but I did not. I observed, quietly, deliberately, and as the evening unfolded, I noticed how naturally everything aligned without me needing to interpret it. Linda was already there, seated comfortably. Her presence settled into the space as if it had always belonged to her. Emily moved around her with ease, attentive in a way that felt practiced, not forced. Daniel followed that same rhythm, and I took my seat without comment, allowing the pattern to reveal itself without interference. And it did, in small moments, in passing gestures, in the way decisions were made without including me, not out of urgency, but out of assumption. And then, halfway through dinner, Emily brought up something that might have once seemed ordinary, She mentioned they were considering making some long-term plans, something about restructuring their finances, possibly investing in property, and she spoke about it with a tone that suggested she was sharing information, not seeking input. And I listened, not interrupting, not questioning, until she paused just long enough for me to respond. And that was when I asked, calmly, directly, what role she expected me to play in those plans. And the silence that followed was not loud, but it was unmistakable. It stretched just enough to reveal what had always been there beneath the surface. Emily glanced briefly at Daniel, then at Linda, and in that moment, I saw it clearly, not confusion, not hesitation, but calculation, a quick adjustment, a silent agreement passing between them without words. And when she finally answered, her voice was still gentle, still controlled. She said, they had not really thought about it in those terms yet, that they just wanted to keep things simple, to make sure everything was handled efficiently, and I nodded, because I understood exactly what that meant. It meant I was not part of the equation they were building, not in any meaningful way, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to soften that realization. I let it exist exactly as it was, and I reached down, almost absent-mindedly, touching the bracelet still resting against my wrist, feeling how light it was, how easy it would have been to ignore, to dismiss, to forget. But I had not forgotten, not for a single moment. And as the conversation moved on, returning to safer topics, I sat there with a clarity that no longer wavered. Everything I had seen, everything I had uncovered, everything I had chosen to understand had led to this. Not a confrontation, not a dramatic reveal, but a quiet confirmation. And I realized then that the most important shift had not happened in that room. It had happened within me. Because while they continued to move within a structure they believed I did not see, I was no longer standing outside of it. Unaware, I was fully present, fully informed, and already steps ahead in a way they had not yet considered. And as I stood to leave that night, offering the same polite goodbye I always had, I felt something settle into place with a calm finality. They believed they had defined my place without my input. But what they did not know, what they had never stopped to consider, was that I had already begun redefining it myself, quietly, completely, and without needing their permission.